also point out that even solutions from the past can become problems today. Like after World War II, we went on this huge infrastructure building spree. Think the interstate highway system.
Which was great for the economy back then.
Right. But there weren't a lot of environmental rules in place, so it also caused some serious damage. And now the laws we have to protect the environment, even though they're super important.
Welcome to Witter. Who Has Time to Read? The podcast that brings deep dives for busy minds. Listen to AI hosts Jane and Dane and get ready to unpack the world's most captivating books in just a fraction of the time. Whether commuting, working out, or just squeezing in a quick break, we deliver key insights, thought-provoking themes, and takeaways you can carry into your day. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Plus, use our links in the description to purchase this book. Your support helps us bring more engaging book discussions to you. Listen and follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Who has time to read? You do, with Witter.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to Witter. You know the deal, we're all about deep dives for those of us who are a little too busy to wade through a whole stack of books.
That's us. We do the readings so you don't have to, but you can still sound smart.
Exactly. And today we're tackling Abundance by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. Kind of an optimistic title for these times, right?
You'd think. But stick with us. There's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, we're going to uncover the core arguments, the big themes, and what we can all take away from abundance and actually use in our lives, all without having to turn down that weekend getaway.
So buckle up, because we're going to explore a future that feels like it's straight out of sci-fi. But it's all based on what could really happen and the choices that are holding us back, maybe in ways you haven't considered.
Okay, so let's dive in. Right off the bat, Abundance paints this picture of the future that's a far cry from our fossil fuel days. Think clean energy, solar panels everywhere, wind turbines, and even next-gen nuclear and geothermal plants quietly humming along. A pretty big shift from those images of smokestacks, you know?
Totally. And it goes beyond just energy. Klein and Thompson talk about these high-tech vertical farms that are like skyscrapers for growing food. They use LEDs to grow all sorts of things, and it could mean we free up a ton of land for reforestation.
And get this. What if we didn't need traditional farms for meat? They talk about cellular meat, where beef and chicken are grown from cells in a lab, no animals involved.
Apparently, almost 25% of the world's land was once used for raising livestock. Cellular meat could change everything.
It's mind-blowing to think about, but the big question they ask is what would make this shift from scarcity to abundance actually happen?
And their argument is it's not a fantasy. We have the tools to make it real.
And that brings us to their main point, and it's pretty straightforward. If we want that abundant future, we need to actually, well, build more of what we need. It sounds simple, but they make a strong case that we're choosing to make things scarce, even when we say we want the opposite.
Yeah. That idea of chosen scarcities is really at the heart of it. Like, we all talk about fighting climate change, but clean energy projects face pushback everywhere. Nuclear plants get shut down, and people even protest against solar farms, which just seems crazy.
It does, and they say it's the same with housing. We all agree that everyone needs a place to live, but in a lot of cities, especially those desirable, expensive ones, it's almost impossible to build new homes. And even in healthcare, we obviously want better treatments and cures, but the way research and funding works and all the regulations, they can actually slow things down.
For sure. It's like we're stuck in this loop where we want something, but then we create roadblocks to getting it.
Can you give us some concrete examples of that, though? Because sometimes it helps to see it playing out in the real world, you know?
Absolutely. Think about a solar farm. Provides clean energy for tons of homes, right? But local communities often oppose them. They're worried about how they look, their impact on wildlife, stuff like that.
Or affordable housing.
Yeah, take somewhere like Seattle or Boston. They desperately need more affordable homes, especially for essential workers. But proposals to build them are often met with resistance from current homeowners who are worried about traffic or their property values going down or just changing the feel of their neighborhood.
So it's this conflict between the big picture and what happens on a smaller scale.
Exactly. And they also point out that even solutions from the past can become problems today. Like after World War II, we went on this huge infrastructure building spree. Think the interstate highway system.
Which was great for the economy back then.
Right. But there weren't a lot of environmental rules in place, so it also caused some serious damage. And now the laws we have to protect the environment, even though they're super important, can make it harder to build the kind of sustainable stuff we need now, like clean energy projects.
It's almost ironic in a way.
It is. The process is meant to make sure we think things through, but it can also become so bogged down that it prevents us from making any progress.
Okay, so how does all this play into politics? Because I know Abundance talks about how different political approaches view these issues.
Yeah, it does. They argue that Democrats have often focused on boosting demand. They do things like subsidize healthcare, provide housing vouchers, and spend on infrastructure.
Makes sense.
Sure. But they say there's been less focus on increasing the supply of those things. Like the idea was, if we put enough money into it, the market will figure it out and provide what's needed.
That's not always how it works.
Nope. The authors suggest it shows that there wasn't enough attention on how to actually make the government work efficiently to produce things. And also that maybe regulations, while often good, can sometimes stifle innovation and make it harder to increase supply.
So they weren't always considering the downsides of those well-intentioned rules?
Right. And Abundance says when you keep demand high but supply stays low, prices go up, and you end up with some form of rationing. It happens in housing and healthcare. More money is being thrown at problems, but there just aren't enough options available.
So what about the Republican approach? What do they say about that?
Well, Republicans usually favor less government involvement. Let the free market handle things. No subsidies. And that can work for things that aren't considered essential, like luxury goods.
Okay, I see.
But it doesn't really solve the problem for things like housing, education, or healthcare. We generally agree that everyone should have access to those things, right?
Right.
So just cutting subsidies doesn't address the root causes of why supply is limited and prices are so high. You have to look at the bigger picture.
They also talk about how economic thinking has changed in recent years. Inflation's a big worry now.
Yeah. After the financial crisis, everyone was worried about demand being too low. So we saw a lot of government spending to try to stimulate the economy and get people spending and investing again. The same thing happened at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic.
But then inflation spiked.
Right. And although inflation has come down from its peak, things are still really expensive, especially basic necessities. It's a major affordability crisis.
And how has that affected the way we think about economics?
It's made us rethink globalization, for one. We realize that relying on these long, complicated supply chains makes us vulnerable, especially when things go wrong.
And it's put the focus back on domestic production, especially when it comes to things like housing.
Exactly. I remember President Biden saying there were basically two ways to lower car prices. Yeah. Make more cars or make people poorer so they buy fewer cars.
Kind of sums it up, doesn't it?
It does. We can't ignore the supply side.
Speaking of solutions, where does technology fit into this vision of abundance? I mean, it can't all be about policy, can it?
Definitely not. Abundance is big on the idea that we need to imagine the future we want and then figure out the technology to make it happen. They bring up this guy, Aaron Bustani, who says that if we want a fairer world, we can't just redistribute what we already have. We need to create more of everything.
And develop new things that can help solve these problems.
Exactly.
But there's got to be a word of caution with all this tech optimism, right?
Oh, absolutely. They reference Neil Postman, who said that technology isn't neutral. It comes with its own built-in ways of changing society. So Abundance says we need to be intentional about steering technology towards good outcomes. Otherwise, all these amazing advancements could just end up making inequality worse.
That makes sense. We have to be mindful of how technology gets used.
For sure. And they also point out that both the right and the left can get stuck in certain ways of thinking. The right tends to romanticize the past, and the left gets caught up in present injustices. And that can make it hard to imagine a better future and work towards it.
They're saying we need to get better at envisioning the future, not just dwelling on the past or present.
Exactly. And Abundance argues that we need to redefine what we even mean by abundance. We've got an excess of consumer goods, all the stuff that fills up our homes, but we're short on the basic things that make life good. Affordable housing, reliable and eco-friendly transportation, clean energy, good health care.
The things that really matter.
Right. So they're saying, let's shift our focus from consuming more to producing more and actually building the future we want. Abundance isn't just about having more stuff. It's about having enough of the things that help us thrive.
So let's talk about some of those essential building blocks, starting with housing. The book talks about grow and how cities seem to be struggling with this idea. They start by talking about Horace Greeley, the guy who said, "Go west, young man."
Yeah. And the book points out, kind of hilariously, that Greeley himself didn't actually go west. He stayed in New York City and became super successful there.
He was city guy.
Total city guy. But it shows this tension between the wide open spaces and the opportunities you find in cities.
And then you fast forward to more recent times. In the early 2000s, Michael Bloomberg said that New York City was a high-end product, a luxury. It's like cities have become these exclusive clubs.
Exactly. It used to be that cities were places where anyone could go to try to make a better life. Now, in a lot of cities, you practically need to be rich just to afford the rent.
So it's become much harder for people to get a foothold, especially if they don't come from money.
Right. And there's this idea from Ed Glazer that cities are all about proximity, about the absence of physical space between people and companies. That's what makes them engines of innovation.
Because when people are close together, ideas flow more freely.
Exactly. And even though it's easier to connect remotely now, being physically present still matters for collaboration.
But the cost of being in those innovative spaces, especially the cost of housing, it's just outrageous.
It really is. And that brings us to this idea of the great divergence that's happening within cities.
So what's the divergence?
So cities have always had two main roles.
Yeah.
Driving innovation and creating opportunity, helping people from different backgrounds climb the economic ladder.
Okay.
But the book argues that while super high housing costs might not hurt innovation too much because wealthy people and companies can still afford to be there, it's making it way harder for people to get ahead. Cities aren't doing such a good job of providing opportunities anymore.
So the divergence is between those who can afford to be in the city and benefit from it and those who can't.
Exactly. And abundance illustrates this with the firefighter test.
What's that?
Could a firefighter, someone who's essential to keeping a city safe, even afford to live in that city?
It's a good question, because in a lot of places, they probably couldn't.
Right. And if they can't, it doesn't just affect their life. It also limits their kids' chances of having a good life in that city.
It makes you wonder how many essential workers can't afford to live where they work.
A lot of them, probably. And this ties into research done by Raj Chetty, who showed that it's gotten much harder for people to move up the economic ladder in the U.S.
The American dream isn't what it used to be.
Basically. For people born in the 1940s, it was pretty much guaranteed that they'd have a better life than their parents. But for those born in the 1980s, it's more like a coin toss.
That's a pretty dramatic shift.
It is. And the book links this trend, at least in part, to rising housing costs.
Okay, so what's behind this huge increase in housing costs? Abundance points to a few things, including zoning regulations and a general resistance to growth.
They talk about this theory from William Fischel, about how trucks and buses change the way cities work.
Interesting. How so?
Well, before those things were common, different parts of the city where people lived, where they worked, and industrial areas were all pretty separate.
Okay.
But as people became more mobile, homeowners started to worry about things they didn't like popping up near their homes. So they started using zoning laws as a way to control what could be built where.
So zoning was originally about separating different types of buildings.
Yeah, at least in theory. It was supposed to be about safety, preventing nuisances, like keeping factories away from homes.
Yeah.
But it often ended up excluding poorer people and minorities from wealthier areas.
Either intentionally or as an unintended consequence.
Right. But it didn't stop there. Zoning became a tool for limiting the number of new homes that could be built, period.
They make this comparison between Lakewood, a post-war suburb that embraced growth, and Petaluma, California, which is known for trying to limit growth.
Yeah, and they argue that a lot of the U.S. has become more like Petaluma. Like we're afraid of growth, even if it means people have nowhere affordable to live.
So what are some of the ways zoning gets used to restrict housing supply?
Well, in places like Westchester County, New York, they have these really low density rules, so you can only build huge houses on big lots, which obviously drives up the price.
So basically only rich people can live there.
Pretty much. And in some places like Bergen County, New Jersey, they've almost completely banned apartment buildings.
Wow.
And then there were things like limiting how much the sewer system can expand.
So you literally can't build more homes even if you wanted to.
Exactly. And there are all these historic districts popping up, which makes it super expensive and complicated to redevelop anything.
It's interesting because they talk about California, which is seen as a very progressive state, but it actually had its first population decline in 2020.
It's kind of ironic. They describe seeing kindness is everything, signs in front yards in these communities where housing is insanely expensive and there are tons of homeless people.
So it's like this clash between wanting to be kind and welcoming, but also not wanting more people to move in.
Exactly. Local communities are often really good at blocking new development, whether it's apartments or anything else.
What kinds of arguments do they use?
Oh, they'll say it'll ruin the character of the neighborhood, create too much traffic, or overload the sewer system, that sort of thing.
So they're using these seemingly practical concerns to prevent more housing from being built.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And the book brings up this argument from Jerusalem Demsus that when we treat houses mainly as investments, as things that go up in value, it creates scarcity, and it pits homeowners against anyone who wants to move in.
Because homeowners want to protect their investment, and that means keeping prices high.
Right. And it makes sense politically. Politicians get elected by the people who already live there, not by the people who might move there in the future.
So they're incentivized to keep things the way they are, even if it means the city becomes unaffordable for a lot of people.
Exactly. And the book argues that this whole anti-growth mindset got a big boost in the 1970s.
Why the 1970s?
A few reasons. Housing prices started going up really fast. People were moving to the suburbs thanks to the interstate highway system. And after the civil rights era, there was pressure to find less obvious ways to exclude people from certain neighborhoods, so zoning became the tool of choice.
It became a way to keep certain people out without being explicitly discriminatory.
Exactly.
Another big thing that affects how and what we build is environmental regulations. They talk about all the environmental laws that were passed in the late 60s and early 70s.
That was a really interesting time. It was a huge bipartisan effort to deal with all the environmental damage that had been done in the years after World War II. We got the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, all these landmark laws.
And those were all good things, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They've made a huge difference in protecting our air and water and natural resources.
But abundance suggests that these laws have also had some unintended consequences, especially when it comes to building things for a more abundant future.
They have. One of the big things they point to is the process of doing environmental impact reports.
Which sounds reasonable on the surface. You want to know what the impact of a project will be before you build it.
Right. But it's become this really complex and time-consuming process that can be used to block projects, even those that are good for the environment, like renewable energy projects and affordable housing.
So it's like this catch-22. We want to protect the environment, but the process for doing so can make it harder to actually build the things that would help us be more sustainable.
Yeah, exactly. And they talk about this case in California, the Friends of Mammoth case, which expanded the scope of the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQ, so that it applies to almost all construction projects. It basically gives anyone who wants to block a project a way to do it.
So even well-intentioned regulations can end up having these really broad, unintended consequences.
They can. And it's interesting because they use this term Californication, which used to refer to all the problems that came with California's rapid, unplanned growth in the 50s. But now it's also come to mean this kind of anti-growth liberalism where people are so worried about the downsides of growth that they end up preventing any growth at all.
And it's not just California. This is happening all over the place.
It is.
They also touch on this idea of degrowth.
Yeah, the degrowth movement believes that we need to shrink our economy to save the planet.
So what do the authors think about that?
They're not convinced. They acknowledge the environmental concerns, but they argue that if we don't keep growing and innovating, we risk ending up with a future that's dominated by authoritarianism and fossil fuels.
So they're saying that degrowth isn't necessarily the answer.
Exactly. And I think the big takeaway from abundance is that a lot of the scarcity we experience isn't because we lack resources or technology. It's because of the choices we're making, the policies we have, and the way we regulate things.
It's a really interesting perspective. We're basically creating our own problems.
In a way, yeah. But the good news is, if we're creating the problems, we can also fix them. The book argues that we have the potential to create a much better future, but we have to be willing to change the way we do things. We need to rethink our priorities, reform our regulations, and adopt a more proactive approach. We have to stop thinking in terms of scarcity and start focusing on building and producing more of what we need.
And this whole tension between regulations, which are often well-intentioned, and their unintended consequences is something we really need to pay attention to.
Absolutely. Because sometimes those regulations end up holding us back from achieving the very goals they were meant to support.
So for our listeners out there, think about the things we've talked about today. What's one area where you see this shift from scarcity to abundance making a real difference? And what are some of those chosen scarcities that we need to overcome to make it happen?
It's a big question, but it's one worth thinking about. How can we move from just managing problems to actually creating a better future where everyone has access to the things they need to thrive?
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive here on Witter. If you're interested in learning more, definitely check out Abundance by Ezra Klein and Thompson. It's full of thought-provoking insights, and it might just change the way you see the world. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.
Thanks for listening to Witter, Who Has Time to Read, produced by One Media. Please support the author by purchasing the book or audiobook using the link in the description. It's a great way to help keep the art of writing alive. And stay in the loop. Subscribe to our newsletter for updates on weekly deep dives. And don't forget to share your thoughts or suggest our next deep dive at witterpodcast@gmail.com.